15,000 feet above Achmer airfield, two P-51 Mustangs rolled inverted and pulled their noses toward the earth. Below them, on a runway carved into the flat farmland east of Osnabrück, two Messerschmitt Me 262 jets were taxiing into position for takeoff, aircraft that, once airborne, could outrun a Mustang by more than 100 miles an hour. On paper, this was a battle the Americans could not win. In 90 seconds, both jets would be burning wreckage on German soil, and the Mustangs would already be climbing for home. The pilot leading that dive, First Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 375th Fighter Squadron, had not stumbled into this moment. He had spent 3 weeks constructing it. To understand why so many other fighter groups had already failed at exactly this maneuver and paid for it in burning airframes, the picture has to widen first, from one cockpit to the entire architecture of the air war over the Reich in the autumn of 1944. The macro picture, a no-go zone drawn in flak B, October 1944. Allied Fighter Command had settled on a hard rule regarding Germany's jet bases. Stay away from them. Achmer and its sister field at Hessepe, home to Major Walter Nowotny's pioneering jet unit, sat almost directly beneath the main bomber approach corridor into the Reich, not by accident, but by design. German planners understood that Allied fighters escorting the bomber stream would be tempted to peel off and strafe the jets on the ground. So they built a killing ground around both airfields. Concentrated batteries of 88mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns, layered with standing patrols of Focke-Wulf 190s, arranged specifically to punish any aircraft that lingered in the airspace above the runways. Fighter-bomber sweeps against Achmer had already cost several squadrons' aircraft for exactly that reason. The tactical lesson, absorbed across the whole of Allied Fighter Command, was binary. Avoid the jets entirely, or accept that attacking near their nest meant flying into a flak box engineered to kill you. That was the strategic map every pilot carried in his head. Drew carried a different one, the micro picture, a 60-second window. Nobody was watching zoom from the airfield down to a single aircraft, and the picture changes entirely. The Me-262's Jumo 004 turbojets were dangerously unforgiving of sudden throttle movement. Push them too hard, too fast, and the engine would flame out or stall its compressor. German jet pilots had no choice but to advance power in careful stages during takeoff. The result was a narrow, brutal vulnerability. For roughly the first 1,000 feet of altitude, an aircraft capable of over 540 miles an hour in level flight was crawling along at barely 200. Gear down, flaps extended, unable to maneuver or accelerate away from anything. The jet's terrifying speed was, for those 60 to 90 seconds, completely irrelevant. The Luftwaffe knew this better than anyone. It was precisely why Achmer's perimeter had been packed with guns and fighter cover in the first place. The trap wasn't the airfield. The trap was time. Any pilot who circled the field, flew a traditional curving gunnery pass, or lingered for a second look was handing German gun crews the 3 or 4 seconds of steady tracking they needed to find the range. A pilot who struck fast, low, and was gone before the guns finished traversing was betting on a gap the defense had never fully closed. Drew had been mapping that gap for weeks. After an earlier mission near Achmer, where his flight spotted Me-262s but failed to close the distance, he began cross-referencing intelligence briefings, not simply where the jets were based, but when they flew, at what altitude, and at what speed his own formation needed to be positioned to convert a sighting into a kill before the jets could climb clear, or the flak crews could range them. As Drew would later put it in his own combat account, the difference between a squadron that watched the jets escape and one that caught them was a matter of seconds, not luck, the product of knowing exactly where the window opened and how long it stayed open. The dive 3 weeks passed without another opportunity. Then, on October 7th, escorting a formation of B-17s home from a refinery raid, Drew's flight spotted a dogfight developing far below and broke away to investigate. Beneath them, on Achmer's runway, sat the Me-262s of Hauptmann Georg Peter Eder's unit, taxiing out to intercept the bomber stream. 1 jet aborted with an engine flameout. 3 continued their role. Drew did not orbit. He did not study the situation twice. He rolled his flight over from 15,000 feet and dove straight at the field, deliberately holding his fire until the jets were airborne, trapped in that low, slow climb-out where their speed meant nothing. By his own account, he caught the second Me 262 at roughly 1,000 feet, doing no more than 200 miles an hour, while his Mustang still carried 450 knots of dive speed. He opened fire from about 400 yards with 30 degrees of deflection, walked his rounds across the wing root and fuselage, and watched the jet explode as it left the ground, almost certainly the aircraft flown by Lieutenant Gerhard Robert. He then cut inside the lead jet's takeoff line and brought that one down too, sending it into an inverted spin before it struck the ground. His wingman, Lieutenant Bill Kemp, flying a Mustang nicknamed Hitler's Nemesis, watched from close behind, close enough that he nearly collided with the spinning wreckage of the second kill, and close enough to see a patchwork parachute, stitched from at least 2 older canopies, open beneath the falling pilot. Friction finds the slow. The flak trap was real, and it proved its teeth within seconds, but only against the aircraft that gave it time to work. As Drew and Kemp broke off and radioed the rest of the flight to hit the deck and clear the area, anti-aircraft fire, that had stayed eerily silent during the dive itself now, opened up in full fury because German gunners finally had a target that wasn't, screaming through their kill zone at 450 miles an hour. Over his shoulder, Kemp watched a second Mustang from another flight, already wrapped in flame from wingtip to wingtip. That aircraft had lingered a few seconds too long near the field. Achmer's flak crews had not failed that afternoon. They had simply never been given the time they needed against Drew's flight, and had been given exactly enough against the pilot who stayed. There is a bitter irony sitting in the middle of this success. Drew's gun camera, meant to provide the routine photographic proof every aerial victory required, jammed due to mismatched color film cartridges. Under normal circumstances, that failure alone would have sunk his claim. Instead, Lieutenant General James Doolittle personally approved both kills within days, almost certainly because decoded Luftwaffe radio intercepts had already confirmed Achmer's losses, and Allied High Command badly wanted a Mustang pilot who had beaten the unbeatable jet, at a moment when Me 262 propaganda was doing real damage to Allied fighter morale. The trap closes on its own architect. The principle Drew exploited did not remain an isolated incident. 1 month later, on November 8, 1944, the same low-speed, low-altitude vulnerability caught the man whose unit the flak rings at Achmer and Hessepe had been built to protect. By that point, Allied fighter bombers had been hitting both fields so persistently that German jets could only get airborne under cover of a full grouper of FW-190s and concentrated ground fire. Major Walter Nowotny himself took off that day to intercept an incoming bomber raid, claimed a kill, then reported engine trouble, and was set upon by a formation of Mustangs. He did not survive the crash. One of Germany's most decorated fighter pilots was killed not because the Me 262 was outclassed in the air, but because the identical vulnerability window Drew had studied for 3 weeks finally closed on the pilot. The entire defensive system existed to shield. Debriefing. Why the trap worked, and why it failed analyzed as an operation rather than a story. 4 factors determined the outcome at Achmer, and they carry lessons well beyond one afternoon in October 1944. First, intelligence discipline beat raw performance. A Mustang's 650 caliber machine guns were never going to outduel a jet in level flight, and every pilot on both sides understood that. What decided the engagement was not firepower, but the willingness to study a narrow technical detail, turbojet spool-up behavior, until it became actionable timing rather than trivia. Second, the German defensive design assumed conventional attacker behavior. Achmer's flak rings were built on the premise that any fighter diving into that airspace would behave the way fighters always had, circling for a clean shot, pressing a second pass, staying in the fight a few seconds longer than strictly necessary. The system had no answer for a single committed pass that refused to linger. Third, timing converted a fair fight into an unfair one, twice in opposite directions. Drew won because he attacked precisely inside the jet's powerless climb-out. Nowotny died a month later for the identical reason. Caught in the same window his own unit's defenses had been built to prevent anyone from exploiting. Fourth, Institutional recognition outpaced physical proof. Drew's claim survived a jammed gun camera only because signals intelligence and command urgency aligned in his favor. A reminder that in total war, confirmation of an action can rest as much on the wider intelligence picture as on the evidence from the cockpit itself. The runway at Achmer is farmland today, but the tactical lesson buried in those 90 seconds, that a technically superior weapon carries its own hidden window of complete vulnerability, and that the side who studies that window with patience will beat the side who merely fears the weapon's headline statistics, remained relevant long after the last Me 262 left German service.